Welcome to the Festival of the Mind 2020. I'm Dr. Iona Hine, and I'm delighted to be here to talk about my project, Cassirer's Oedipus, Distant Takes. So, I'm here today in a fairly unusual situation because the entirety of the project we're talking about has been done at a distance. This is the closest I have been to my fellow panellists, even though we are, I'm delighted to say, well, I'm glad to say in the situation, socially distanced. But first I should just explain who this Cassirer is. Heinz Cassirer was born in 1903, grew up in Germany and left in the early 1930s under pressure because he was a Jewish academic and academia in Germany was not making Jews welcome. He found himself in the UK, where he moved from his original training in classics and classical philology he was suddenly forced to become a philosopher and an expert on Kant, in which he followed a little bit the footsteps of his father, Ernst Cassirer. But Heinz Cassirer, in later life, began to teach himself about the Bible. He became a biblical scholar. That's part of how I come to be interested in him as someone who is also a biblical scholar. And he got into translation. So he translated right from his early years in the 1920s through until the last year of his life. And the last thing that he translated was Sophocles' Greek play, Oedipus at Colonus. That translation remained unpublished. And my work at the moment is digitizing his works, including works that had not been published in his lifetime or since. And I'm here today with cast members who have helped bring that script to life, because how do you digitize a play? Surely it's not just by providing the text for others to read, but doing something with it. So here with me, I have got Julia Lockwood-Byers, who reads Antigone. I have got Jim Buck, who reads the part of the chorus. And I've got Mitchell Nuttall, who reads Creon. So we're going to be talking together about the experience of making the play, and more specifically, so the reason that these people have got involved with this project is because they were already preparing for a version of the play. They were rehearsing Robert Fagel's translation of Oedipus at Colonus for a production that should have taken place this April at Theatre Delhi in Sheffield. But as we're all too familiar with, COVID-19 interfered, theatres closed, and therefore that production did not go ahead. So I, as someone with an obvious interest in Oedipus at Colonus, had been following the progress of that play and made contact with the director, Eric Bohan, to say, well, actually, is there something else that we might do, given that I've got this version of the play, and it would be really a unique experience to talk with people and work with people who were familiar with one English version of the play and work with another. And so during lockdown, we produced a full audio recording of the play in Cassirer's translation. And that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about the experience of doing that, how we did it, how it felt, and a bit about the two different translations. And there will be a chance, assuming we don't talk ourselves out of time, to ask some questions, and any questions that we don't manage to pick up on during the session, I will be following up on the Cassirer website. So that seems like enough of an introduction and enough from me, really. So having mentioned that the Theatre Delhi the production got cancelled, and I can only imagine that was really disappointing, because I know you were just a month out. You were at the dress rehearsal stage pretty much. So, and that must have, and within a week or two of that, I'd reached out to Eric, and so you've got this kind of slightly strange invitation. So, Jim, I know you were actually the quickest on the uptake. Very quickly, Eric wrote, and you wrote straight back saying, "Count me in." Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, it was at first encountering the Cassirer text was a bit of a contrast with Fagel's. It's very different. Fagel's is like a finely cut gem, And the Cassirer was a bit dusty, and it scrubbed up really nicely, I thought. Yeah. So I was pleased to encounter it. I learned more, I think, about Oedipus from the Cassirer than I did from Fagles. The Fagles text is as much about Fagles and his talents as a translator and writer. And
so that's an interesting thing. It actually reminds me that when at the point that I wrote to you all, we didn't quite, I didn't have the script. So we were already locked down in our own homes, and I was locked down at my home, and the material of the archive that I was digitising I had a small part of, but the bits I had didn't involve the script. So I had a very small sample I was able to be sharing with you. But yes, it speeded my work somewhat when you were so keen to say yes. Mitchell, you're a little bit slower to...
Yeah. In the Fagles play, I had 3 characters that I was performing, Citizen, Ismene and Creon. And because I was aware that this would be like an audio play, the invite that you sent, I thought, am I going to get 3 characters again? Can I handle that? Will I be able to get their meanings, their point across? Will I be able to do right by it sort of thing and get the writing across? But I looked at it and I thought, no, this is a great opportunity. If I do the 3 characters, I'll do the best that I can. If I do only 1, that's great as well, as long as I'm just involved. And with loving the Fagles translation so much, and with that play sadly not going ahead, I really did want to get involved and perform it in some way. And it was a great experience for me because it was the first time I've done performing via recording. Everything I've done previous is as being live to an audience.
So we'd hoped to have my colleague Ellie Pickersgill with us today. She was really crucial to us being able to put together an audio version because each of the cast recorded lines in their own home independently, individually, so not actually in conversation with the rest of the cast. And in a way, this is kind of like a cruel trick that I played on you, because I think when I first reached out to everybody, I said, well, what we're going to do is, a bit like today, only each in our own homes, we will live stream and read the lines. But then we quickly realised that the internet is a huge hazard to that, and I discussed with colleagues, and we came back with a different plan, which Ellie was able to make happen by editing together the separate recorded lines. And we actually have a little audio clip we can play to show just how intricate that is. So I think this is around lines 830 onwards in the play. So we'll just listen to that and listen to how the actors' lines play together.
Oh, the misery of it, wretched creature that I am! How can I make my escape? What protection can I receive, whether from the gods or mortal men?
What are you doing, stranger?
I shall not seize the man, but as for her, she is mine.
Ah! You leaders of the country!
What you are doing is unjust.
It is just.
How is it just?
Those I am taking belong to me.
City! The wretchedness of it!
What are you doing? Will you not let alone?
So that clip comes from part 5. The audio version is available on the festival website to listen through, and that's in part 5. And it helpfully features all of you, but really showing how complex it is to splice together this dialogue that sometimes in Sophocles is really kind of flicking very quickly between characters. It does occur to me, though, that one thing we haven't done yet is to sort of explain a little bit what the play is about. So is anyone sort of wanting to, daring to sum up what Sophocles' play?
Well, I was thinking about the plot of the play at home and thinking it would take pages and pages to recount the story. But my daughter, Bathsheba, who is also my sister, is mainly in the play, she said, I'll do it. And so she wrote a very short plot summary. So I'll read it. There was this guy called Oedipus, and some dude made a prophecy that he would kill his dad and marry his mum, both of which he kind of accidentally did. He was really sad about this, so he stabbed his eyes out in the previous play. Now he's blind. He was king of Thebes, but his mum's brother, Creon, kicked him out, and now Creon is king instead. Maybe Oedipus is hanging out in the woods near Athens, being blind, with his daughter Antigone. Theseus is the king of Athens, and he's a pretty chill guy. So he was like, yeah, you can hang out in the woods being blind. Oedipus has another daughter, Ismene, who shows up on a horse. Oedipus also has two sons who are fighting each other because they both want to be king. This is somehow relevant to Ismene showing up on a horse. There is a prophecy. Oh, yes, there is. Then Creon turns up. He wants Oedipus to come back, not to be king, but because apparently everyone wants Oedipus to die in their back garden because it'll bring you good luck. Oedipus isn't too thrilled. Then one of those two sons, Polynices, shows up, but Oedipus is really mad at him for some reason, so he doesn't want to hang out. Then Polynices goes off to kill his brother. There's a big thunderstorm. Anyway, in Greek tragedy, apparently excess sufferings makes you kind of holy. So the gods finally take pity on Oedipus and he flies off to heaven. But no one is allowed to watch because it's kind of private. Also, apparently, this is a good thing for Athens. So Theseus is pretty happy about it. The end.
It's a pity we didn't have that in Bathsheba's own voice, but thank you. That was quite a detailed plot summary there. But I think the point that comes out is that we arrive, all of this backstory behind Oedipus. So in popular culture, possibly the one thing you can rely on people being likely to know about Oedipus is that he's had an inappropriate relationship with his mother, right? That's the kind of critical thing. And all of that stuff lies in the past in the play. So it's the chorus who has the job of sort of dragging out of Oedipus and putting that bit of context into this play.
Well, it occurs to me, what I've sort of learnt from both versions of the play was the similarities between Oedipus and Jesus. An appreciation of a different appreciation than I had previously of the concept of original sin. Because Oedipus is, it's this kind of sin of origin, is kind of originated children by his mother, but innocently and guilty at the same time. It's very kind of striking that I wonder how these sort of kind of resonate, these two versions of sin have resonated off each other. Which has influenced which?
It is a really interesting question, and I don't know if you felt any differences around Cassirer's text. So I haven't particularly thought about Oedipus and Jesus in parallel, but I can definitely see what you're talking about, this idea that, so Oedipus very much has this very strong point of he may have done these things, so he may have killed his father, he owns that, and he may have slept with his mother, but he didn't know he was doing that, right? He has this really strong kind of argument of, well, yes, I've done things that we construe as wrong, but I didn't know, whereas all you lot are doing things knowing who I am and etc. And you do things knowingly. So how come it's bad that I've done these things, especially given that an oracle said I was going to do it in the first place? And I think this is part of what grabbed Cassirer about it as a text, that it was dealing with this kind of thing about guilt, freedom, responsibility. To what extent is Oedipus responsible? But then that thing around, in the translation, there are one or two times it really sprang out for me that the language was almost biblical. And this is at a point in Cassirer's life when he has translated the New Testament. He converted and was baptized in the Church of England. So he was living an experience as a Jewish Christian at this point in time in his own self-definition. And so I think there are little bits of that creep in, and where he talks about sin, which isn't a very... isn't necessarily an obvious classical Greek idea. And there are echoes around In fact, if I look carefully, I may have in my notes something around sin's bringing, which is in his New Testament as well. He talks, it's a kind of pivotal text in his own conversion story, is around springing.
Let's talk about Oedipus having an excess of life, which is as much a sin as any other sin that's committed. I found that insane.
Yes, so it's, I suppose actually, yeah, I don't want to go too far down what might be a tangent. Right. Mostly I was just getting to, of course, Jesus can't, never mind. I won't try and get into that because it's probably beyond where we should be. I don't want to commit too much heresy. That's my. But yeah, there's a line that Antigone has where it ends with sort of forever and ever. I don't know if that. This is that thing. So because you recorded it, and then I could listen back, and I spent quite a bit of time with Ellie kind of feeding back on things, so really listened to it. And there were bits that sort of jumped out. And in Greek, it's not forever and ever. It's, for an age or something to the end of the age. But forever and ever felt very sort of reminiscent of sort of Lord's Prayer and Christian rituals. So there were just elements where I felt like that Cassirer's life experience is feeding into how he sees the text and how it comes across to us in English. I mean, is that something did it feel different to Fagles?
Yeah, definitely. Something that I would sort of like to know a bit more about is what are the skills for a translator? Because I've done now Fagles translations and Cassirer's, and what even though it's the same storyline, they are incredibly different in their writing at major points. So what does a translator need to actually get that across and to get that into English while at the same time doing it justice? Because I would imagine that for a translator there's a certain sense of obligation to get it across as accurate as possible. Would that be, am I right in saying that? Or
I think that's a really interesting question, especially in the context of Cassirer as translator, because he translated different kinds of texts. But so we're starting to look at Fagles. So Fagles was a professor of English. He was a poet. He became renowned for his translations of classical texts, and his translation of Oedipus at Colonus was produced probably in the same year that Cassirer is translating. So I think that's quite unusual that we have these kind of two contemporary texts from the late 70s. And one of the things that's noticeable about his style is that he adapts a lot to modern idioms. So you're getting the characters speaking as if they were people living in the 20th century, right? And they'll use colloquialisms and etc. So that's a kind of a free approach. He's still working with the Greek text and closely enough that it's a satisfying translation in some respects. Though he is a little bit free with some things, like you referred to playing the citizen, which so in Greek the word is xenos, which is where we get xenophobia from, right? So the fear of the outsider, the fear of the stranger. So it's kind of odd that in Fagles' text it's become citizen. I'm not quite sure what his logic is, except that this character is a sort of citizen of the local area. So he is adapting, so it makes sense for the English audience. But that thing around obligation and do you need to stay close to the text and what you're actually, what the goal is of the translation is one that, at some level every translator must weigh up. Yeah. Most acutely, so part of the pleasure of the archive that I'm working with is it has some correspondence from the posthumous publications. So a couple of Cassirer's works have been published posthumously, and one of those is his New Testament translation, and there's a whole sort of set of letters between the publishers and Ronald Wiseman, who was Cassirer's friend, who was carrying forward the editing work and getting this stuff published. Where the publishers are writing to say, well, we've had an expert read this and he's not convinced it's a translation. He thinks it's too loose, right? And that's because Bible translation is held to a particularly high standard.
Yeah.
And they're like, it might damage the press if we publish this as a translation. And so there's a whole to and fro, and at some point I will kind of write about that so that other people can, read it without having to sort of look at the letters directly. But that, Bible translation is a particular field where people get very hot under the collar about what is and isn't a translation. And I think Cassirer, most of the time, is a sort of a closer translator in the way that he has things in English. But then, because I thought we were going to discuss this, there was one example I lined up. So this is the Creon's, your first line in the Cassirer text. It comes at around about line 728, I think, in the Greek. So if we can just hear that.
You who are the men, being of noble birth, among those who live in this country.
So I've picked that, and it's possibly a slightly cruel pick, but it's one of those points where I feel like it's not very smooth. It's not quite how, whereas if you were to hear, Fagles on the same bit, it says sort of noble old men, the pride of your land, right? So that's much more easy to unpick. And, for me, because I can go and look at the Greek, I was like, well, what's he doing? What's he up with the Greek? And there are definitely ways in which I can see that he's close to the Greek, but there are times when I also sense that he's not a native English speaker. Though maybe that's a little unfair, because maybe that's too easy of an explanation, given that he had been writing in academic English for 40 years at this point in time. So, but there is just that sense that I suppose it's an unpolished translation, because it's one of only two things in the archive of materials I have that remain in Cassirer's own handwriting. So he'd done his first draft, but he hadn't necessarily gone back and done the polishing. But one of the kind of requirements that's often made if you are actually commissioning someone to do a translation is that they should be translating into their own first language in order to get a kind of natural fluidity to it.
That's one thing. My partner, Chris Brooke, who plays Theseus, wondered about the Cassirer translation. He thought, was it totally finished? Would he have wanted it to be finished? Would he wanted it to be published?
So we do have actually it's a second-hand report, but it's Ronald Wiseman, his friend, who was also the person who typed up a lot of the stuff and did see some other works through to publication. And he says that Cassirer was really excited to have people read this. He wanted it performed. And there is a bit of evidence. So we're definitely the first recorded reading produced under very unusual circumstances, but there are indications that the play had been read collectively before, because there are multiple photocopies of one typescript version in the archive. So that gives me enough of a clue that this has been read by a group of people before. So he was very keen that it be read, and that was his reason for translating it, so people could get involved with this text, because it clearly spoke to him at that moment in his life.
Yes, I was going to ask that, because in your introduction you wrote that Cassirer had a long-standing interest in human and philosophical concepts of freedom, and maybe that was why he decided to translate this play.
Right, so this is talking about in the script, the digital script, which is available on the Cassirer project website. I wrote an introduction, which I wrote partly for the fact that this script needed something to explain itself, because I'm trying to create things that will endure, and knowing that this was going to be what you as a cast would get as a bit of explanation about it. So Cassirer, I said earlier, so he was partly a philosopher, and his original studies were about Aristotle and Aristotle's work on the soul, and so not in a kind of particularly religious take, but much more about the kind of biology of how do your thoughts make your body move, right? So he's quite interested in that sort of that inner working. And then as he moves through and life, when he's forced out of Germany, he has to revise his plans for an academic career, and he ends up working in moral philosophy, and he's looking at Kant and Kant's ideas of how we make sense of an internal struggle where we feel that we know what we're supposed to do, but we're not very good at doing it. We're not very good at being moral beings. So then he's interested. And there's some kind of a connection there between how is it that on the one hand we can have these kind of thoughts, on the other hand we're so rubbish at carrying them through. But I think that, then that kind of arcs off as he starts reading Paul's letters in the original Greek, which eventually leads him to decide that Paul's got better answers than Kant. And that, again, is around Paul's account of sin, and that actually it's the law, it's knowing what you should do that is causing you the problems. And if you accept grace, then that's going to, and effectively... But so there's a whole arc through his life around this relationship between the mind and the body, and that's got a kind of a moral hinge. And I think when he gets to Oedipus, we've got precisely that kind of rich stream of Oedipus saying, well, yes, I'm guilty, but how, am I more guilty than you just because the things that I've done are seen to be terrible in the morals of well, I did them innocently, and that, yes, that comes into what you were saying before, Jim, about this kind of the sense that there's something like original sin here, that he can't escape his guilt, but how guilty actually is he while he's done these awful things. And so so there's that element, but also I think that it's coincidence that this is Cassirer's last work and was also Sophocles' last play. But there's the element of Oedipus as the migrant. He's been forced out of his homeland by his kin after the realization that he'd married his mother and etc. And then so he's been forced to live in exile. And Cassirer logically saw some echo of his own life, that he had been forced out of Nazi Germany and come to survive in exile. And that kind of not being something chosen any more than Oedipus chooses to leave. And Oedipus does exercise his power at the end by refusing to go where everybody sort of is begging him to come die in their land, and so, I'm going to die in this land.
One thing I can't understand, because you also put that it was a further articulation of the complexity of moral freedom. And I just thought, when Oedipus actually gets the chance to use some moral freedom of his own in relation to Polynices and his sons, he doesn't exactly use it very well, I don't think. I don't know what other people think about that. He's very unforgiving.
So we'll recap. So Polynices is one of two twin sons of Oedipus and his mother, and a brother, therefore, to Antigone and Ismene. And he turns up wanting an audience with his father because he is intending to go and fight his twin brother to take power back in Thebes. And he's got a gang together to go and take that battle. And he's heard that the important thing is to have Oedipus with him, because Oedipus, is going to be the guarantee of victory. So Polynices presents for an audience. Are we sympathetic to Polynices?
Well, during one of the rehearsals with the Fagel translation, I read Polynices because the actor who should be there wasn't there. And it just came out, and I thought, as a kind of guile that Polynices was using. He was dissembling. He was actually very pleased at his father's decrepit condition. And I think I wonder whether that is actually in the text, whether that was Sophocles' meaning, that Oedipus could see through his son. He saw, to go back to biblical terms again, he saw Satan in his son, in the way that Jesus saw Satan in Judas at the Last Supper.
I didn't see it in that way at all. I thought Polynices was sympathetic, and Antigone, his sister, really feels for him and is devoted for him. And I don't understand, when all that's happened to Oedipus in his life, he can't show some sympathy to his own sons. I mean, I don't know the time span. I don't know how young the sons were when Oedipus was exiled, and I don't know how many years have passed since then. but it just seems so cruel to exercise his moral freedom in that way.
So, I mean, we don't have exact details, but so Oedipus does kind of blame, he says that they have expelled him, which suggests that they were old enough to have agency, but then Creon, their uncle, is...
With region talking.
Perhaps it could have been the Oedipus's sort of like freedom that he discovered at that moment was to maybe not get involved, was to say, no, you all didn't do anything when I was exiled from the city, and perhaps he was like, okay, you're my son, but I don't want to be involved in this. I don't want to be involved in these wars. I'm going to stay here, and this is going to be my freedom. This is going to be my choice. Perhaps it was that way that he was looking for it, looking at it maybe.
Well, being kind to one of the sons is being cruel to the other. Anyway.
Perhaps he didn't want to pick sides and was just like, I've gouged my own eyes out because of what I discovered I did, even though I did it innocently. That this is my punishment. I'm not getting involved now with anything else. I'm going to stay here and you lot can do what you want. You didn't help me. Why should I pick any of your sides?
I know at that point he's almost becoming holy. It's almost time for his end. But at the same time, he tells Polynices to die. He doesn't say, oh, I'm going to step aside, but he does actually want him to be dead. He wants that prophecy that Ismene has brought to be fulfilled.
Or is he just accepting? So his whole life has been framed by this kind of prophecy, the reason that he can unknowingly encounter his father and mother the way he does is because they've abandoned him as a baby, because it's been predicted that he'll do those things to them. So if he's just lived with the reality of oracles, then he's just saying, well, that's how it is, son. Yeah. But it's really interesting. It's a characteristic of the play that I think your sympathies can really feel quite complex around Polynices. I noticed listening and having the advantage of being able to listen to it, how long Oedipus stays silent. Polynices has this really long speech, and then there's just this wall of silence from Oedipus, and that's one of the beauties of listening to it, kind of feeling that kind of reluctance. We've got a question coming through from the live stream. This is about your experience of the wordiness of the translation. So I think it's fair, that little example that we've had to say that Cassirer is sometimes very wordy, and how I think because he's trying to represent the Greek, he is his word order sometimes is very un-English because he's being attentive to the word order in the Greek and trying to do something in terms of representing that. How was it to work with Cassirer's English?
I found it more comfortable in the end than Fagles, because Fagles is a very in some ways I don't like to choose the word elitist, but it's kind of, it's a you translation. It's what you're going to see at the National Theatre, what you're going to see anywhere in the English-speaking world. You're going to get that kind of language coming out, Whereas I felt with Cassirer's, it was more like it was, maybe this is influence of the lockdown, it was as if he was kneading the language and making bread with it. Whereas Fagles is delivering you sliced bread.
Well, that's a hot take. I'm reminded, and I'm only going to ask you this, Mitchell, because I know you're happy to talk about it. Yeah. Early on in the process, you let me know that you have dyslexia.
Yeah.
Which obviously makes it that much harder to work with a text. So how was it working with Cassirer's text, and was it different to your experience with Fagles?
It was definitely different in the sense that even though it was more or less the same storyline, because the wording was different points were being emphasised at different times. So trying to get my sort of dyslexia around that and making sure that when I was reading the lines, I was understanding the punctuation and making sure I was making the right point without being too influenced by the Fagles translation. That was quite an experience in itself, because I had to sort of do justice to the play and make sure that I was being clear and I was if I was angry, I was being angry. If I was sad, I was being sad, and trying to get that across. I think Fagel's translations was probably more to home. I'm Yorkshire born and bred, so I think I was able to understand the Fagel's translation a bit more in that sense with the language that I've grown up with. Cassirer's was definitely a bit harder in terms of trying to pinpoint the words and figure out what he was saying. He was quite articulate with his wording, I think, and he what am I trying to say? He was quite the points weren't always clear. In some ways, it was like, right, what is he actually trying to say here? Where I felt that with Fagel's, it was a little bit easier for me to understand in that regard. But to do two different translations of the same text, which I've never done before in my acting career, that was a whole new experience for me to see how, even though you can have the same storyline, the points that are made throughout can be massively different, and they can be emphasised at different times. And that was something that I struggled with quite a lot in the two translations.
Yeah, I found things that I loved in both of them. I loved the Fagel's, the rhythm of the language, which he was very kind of obvious, and particularly in the chorus, I thought the rhythm came through a lot. I loved the rhythm and the poetry, just the actual words he used. They were so poetical. But the Cassirer one, I liked equally because you seem to really feel the emotion of the characters, I think, in it. And even though the sentences were longer, you could still understand what he was trying to say. I think he actually analysed things sometimes in a, not putting this very well, in a deeper way, though the Fagel's was often more succinct. And did you say it was more modern, did you say?
I think with the Fagel's, the emotions there, he's done it all for you. He's put the gleam in the jewel, and you're just a temporary, as much as just a temporary resident of that. You can't fail very much. But with the Cassirer, you bring something of yourself to it. You have to make it work. And that's why I enjoyed it in the end. I enjoyed doing the Cassirer more than the Fagel's. But I did enjoy the Fagel's, but I enjoyed the Cassirer more.
Yeah, I love them both, but I thought when you did the chorus as a one-man chorus, it actually really worked. I didn't expect it to do, because with the Fagel's, it is very polyphonic. It has so many different sides to the character of the chorus in the Fagel's. But in the Cassirer, you just made it one really human, interesting character. You just, I don't know, you really brought it to life.
Somebody who writes letters to the newspaper kind of guy.
Yeah.
So I mean, there is one clip that we've got left lined up that I think is a really interesting clip, and it's one of the moments where I feel quite strongly that Cassirer does something better with the English than Fagel's on that particular point. So this is fairly early in the play, around about line 70 in the Greek. We get a conversation between the chorus and Oedipus.
Would one of your number go to him to act as envoy? The aim would be that, giving a little help, he should gain much. Whatever we shall say, the words we shall speak, shall none be blind.
So that's the stranger. In my head we had the chorus, but that was the stranger and Oedipus. And the stranger kind of looking at Oedipus and seeing an old blind man. Now that's how, as you know, Cassirer's Oedipus describes himself as an old blind man. But you can see that the stranger kind of underestimates, well, what could you possibly have to offer, as you know? And the response these words, shall none of them be blind. For me, it spoke quite powerfully about ableism and the way in which people are very quick to judge on what they can see you can't do, and therefore assume a whole load of other incompetencies rather than look beyond that. So I don't know if that or if there were any other kind of moments in the Cassirer text that particularly struck you.
Well, I think that does say a lot, that line. It is really sort of impressive. And I found a lot of the lines were too. I mean, there's a line of Antigone's I thought was really beautiful. It was, he was caught up by the fields of an invisible realm, a mysterious death, carrying him off. I just really liked that line. It just seemed to be very mystical and beautiful and poetical.
Yeah, I in Fegel's translation, I played that character of the stranger, of the citizen, talking to Oedipus. And just going back a little bit to the point of wording, in the Fegel's translation, I do definitely feel that the point is put across a bit more in a way that's sort of like where you still can. It's a bit more to home, as I was saying. Whereas with the Caesar's translation, listening to that, it is definitely, you kind of have to think about it, I think, more, is what I'm trying to say. You don't necessarily have to think so much with the Fegel's translation. It's sort of language that we may come across in our day-to-day lives. Whereas Caesar's, definitely, I found you having to think about it a little bit more.
So I think what's really interesting about that clip, and really for parity I should have had the Fagels lined up, is that the stranger's line is less clear, his question, and especially because, if you were looking critically at the English, there's an extra kind of word in that I don't think any native English speaker would have included, right? But the answer, Oedipus's answer, and again, it's my fault because I didn't bring my notes, so I don't remember exactly, but Oedipus's answer is far less kind of, for me, it's far less effective than Cassirer's, and it's just how both translators bring something rich, and yet there's always some other dimension that we're kind of getting at.
I can give you a line of the stranger from Fegel's translation, if you like, which was just included in that. When Oedipus is talking to the stranger, he turns around and says, "And what is there to gain from a man who cannot see?" It's quite simple and sort of to the point. Well, what's there to gain? Whereas just listening to that, there is that slight little difference where you do have to figure the wording out a little bit more.
So it's the many years ago, I was involved in, I shouldn't call it a travesty, but I was involved in performing a classical Greek play where the director worked with several translations and was kind of cutting and pasting and putting them together. Wow. It would be a really interesting thing to kind of mishmash the Cassirer and the Fagels.
Yeah.
But I don't think Ellie would play ball with us if we needed another edit.
Can I just say something about Ellie? I think if we were the Beatles, she's George Martin. She did wonders, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's four of us in the space, and that's just as well for the social distancing. But this project was made possible by the collaboration of a lot of people, all of whom you'll find credits for if you go to the Festival of the Mind webpage. But one other who I've not mentioned, and I will because I think she really brought something extra to it, is Rachel McNiven, who's provided the artwork so that for every section of the play you've got the kind of a representation of the scene that helps you carry that picture. Of what's what. Well, I think that we've arrived surprisingly fast at the end of our 45 minutes. So I want to thank you for tuning in and listening to us. If you haven't already looked at and listened your way through Cassirer's Oedipus, that opportunity awaits you, and you can do it in nice kind of shortish portions rather than take the whole 2.5 hours at once. I am really grateful to Julia and to Jim and to Mitchell for coming along today and taking the risk of this live conversation. Please follow the Festival of the Mind website for more information about other live stream events, exhibitions and podcasts coming up. Thank you.